So, Brad, why don't you share your screen and we can get started? Or maybe I'll just ask everybody for a quick intro first. So, uh, I'm Kanav, one of the chapter leaders of New York chapter, and we have Sham with us as well, who's the other chapter leader. So, hey, everybody. Brad is the guest of honor who's going to give us an awesome talk. So, before we proceed, would love to know the other folks on the call as well, since we have just a few folks on the call. So, why don't we start off with a quick intro with Neil and essentially talk about how long have you been using Slack? Are you a developer or are you like a power user of Slack? And any expectations you have from this talk? And before you can start, I can give you a little bit of my own background, which is that I started using Slack, I think sometime in 2016. We then decided to build a company on top of Slack starting in 2017. And launched an app in the marketplace in 2017. We built Attendance Spot, which is a HR app on top of Slack, and about a team of 10 or so people at this point, right? Have been a chapter leader for about 2 years at this point. And at least for this year, this has been our first meetup because of COVID. We have had a couple of meetups prior in Slack's New York office. Sham, why don't you give a quick intro about yourself and then we can go to Neil perhaps?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Sham. I work for Peloton and I work as a solutions architect. I've been using Slack for close to 2 years and I am a power user. I am the workplace admin for my company. And I help our internal employees with integrations with like other products like Jira, Monday.com, and I'm also responsible for analytics. This is my first event as a chapter leader for New York, and I've been working with Kanav. So I'm excited to have Brad and everyone here.
Awesome. So Neil, if you can unmute yourself and give us a quick intro about how long have you been using Slack, what's your interest in using Slack, and any special request for today's session.
I know when I joined, it didn't give me the option to use my mic. You did something. Okay. I don't know if other people are in that same boat. Maybe someone in chat can let us know. Oh.
Okay, so I'm making everybody into a presenter mode, and then I'll undo that after. Okay, so now everybody should be able to unmute themselves, I guess. So Neil, if you can hear me, if you can unmute yourself and do a quick intro about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. So my name is Neil. I am a software engineer at Troops. Been there about, it's been like 4 years now, forever in small company land. We integrate, it started off as an integration primarily of Salesforce with Slack, helping salespeople keep up with what they're doing, like taking a database and actually telling people useful stuff about it. That's what I do. No specific expectations for the talk. I just didn't see it at the first time, so I thought this would be a great chance to catch up. Excited to see it.
Excellent. Nina, why don't you go next?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm Nina. I'm also Slack platform from Vienna, Austria, actually. So joining from it's 7:30 right now. But happy to join. I'm one of the founders of Yodel.io. It's basically a business phone system integrated in Slack. So we've been building on top of Slack since 2015. I unfortunately missed the frontiers, so basically wanting to recap what was going on and also just wanting to learn more about Slack. I'm not a developer myself, but of course involved with a lot of product decisions.
Hey, thanks for the intro, Nina. We'll go to Richard as well.
Hi there, Richard here. So I would definitely say I'm kind of like more of a Slack power user than like an active developer, although I started my career as a developer, but it's been a while since I've written any really terrible code. So, but definitely like interested in learning about how I can get more out of it. We use a decent number of like Slack integrations at work, and really want to see kind of what more we can do to tie in like some of the specifics of the way our platform works with Slack. So excited to learn more. And yeah, I work at a company called DevPost. We run loads of virtual hackathons and have a really big developer community. So always kind of super interested to learn more what's going on in this program. So thanks for making the time to do the presentation. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro, Richard, and thank you everybody else. So Brad, we'll hand it over to you, and you can start off with a quick intro, and then let's just jump right in.
All right. Let me move this window over here. Cool. So I probably share a little in common with a lot of folks on the call. I joined Slack a little over 2 years ago. I'm a software engineer at Slack, and I've worked on the workflow builder, and then most recently the steps from apps that we just launched at Frontiers to let apps provide steps inside of workflows. Before that, I was working on 2 other products that were on top of Slack. Man, I don't even know how, it was probably maybe 2015 or so. It was right before Slack launched the actual platform. And the only way you could really build on Slack was using a bot connected to the RTM over a socket, and then whatever you could do there. So it's come a long way since then. But initially I worked on, we were building a hosting platform for Slack apps. At the time, it was challenging. We were trying to figure out what are some ways we could build some of the things we wanted to build on top of Slack, and we kind of realized, man, there's like a lot that goes into building a scalable bot that's WebSocket based, that it can be installed on thousands of teams. So we started going down that route, and like once the Events API came, and that was called Beep Boop. Once the Events API came out, hosting a Slack bot started to look a lot like hosting any kind of HTTP based piece of software. And the value add that there were still some things we tried to do to make it as seamless as possible to like set up and run and deploy a Slack application. But we started to see the things that people were building and wanting to do on Slack. And that ended up, we transitioned into a product called Missions that was basically a workflow engine on top of Slack for non-technical users. And that was kind of the precursor to Workflow Builder. Slack acquired us when we were doing Missions. And then we turned that into Workflow Builder, and we've just been continuing to go from there. So I definitely I can relate a lot with any of you that have built products or even companies on top of Slack. And the benefits you get from that, along with the challenges, familiar with a lot of them. Anyways, that's a little about my background, an overview of what I was planning on going through today, and I'm happy to like field as many questions or that we have as they come up as we go through it. But was to give you a little bit of insight of this new feature that we launched for Workflow Builder inside of Slack. And that's called Steps from Apps, and it allows third-party applications to provide steps that are available inside of Workflow Builder. So what we'll do is I'll give a little overview of a use case that can benefit from building a step from app, and then we'll dive into actually building that with the code, and then hopefully have some time at the end for Q&A.
Sounds good.
All right, so let me jump over to kind of give an overview of what is this showing up all right for people? It's a little bigger here.
Screen isn't shared yet.
Oh, I haven't, have I? That would probably help. All right.
Yep. Now we can see it.
All right, so I've got here a workspace where there's this fictitious workspace where there's an IT team that has 2 channels. They have a help IT channel and a team IT channel. And they kind of organize their work this way so that people within the company can come to the Help IT channel and they can request help for whatever it is that they need. And then inside of the Team IT channel, those are all the members of the actual IT team. They can field those support requests. So what they've done is they've built a workflow. So this is a workflow inside a workflow builder. If you haven't used workflow builder before, you can launch it underneath the tools section, and that pops this right open. They've got a workflow here that starts with a shortcut inside of the Help IT channel, and it prompts a form that asks the user what they need help with. It sends a message to let them know that someone will get in touch with them shortly, and then also sends the details of that form that was filled out into their Team IT channel, along with the details of it, to let them know, hey, so-and-so needs help with this particular problem. So what that looks like is someone might come into here, open this menu, and click Request Help. They might say, like, I'm having a problem with the ticketing system, can't log in. So they'd submit that. The user that just submitted it sees this message, and this message will kind of be the basis of some communication that the team will give them. But then over in the Team IT channel, it mentions the channel, which notifies everybody and lets them know, hey, so-and-so needs some help, and here's the request that they put in. So it's pretty simple, pretty lightweight. Lots of ways they could start to make this a little bit more useful. But one of the things that is maybe not ideal with it is that it's mentioning the whole channel, and they might not want to bug everybody every single time a support request comes in. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a step from an app to pick a random member of their Team IT channel and basically assign that ticket to them. So what I'll do is I'll add a step right here. And if you've used Workflow Builder in the past and you haven't seen this is going to look a little different. Initially, we only had these 2 steps right here. And with the launch for steps from apps, the library of steps you have can grow considerably depending on what kinds of apps you have installed and if they have steps. So in this case, I've got this step that I built, and this is the one that we'll dig into and build. Select a random channel member. I'm going to go ahead and add that. And it wants me to pick a channel that is going to choose the random member from. So I'll pick the Team IT channel because that's the sort of the membership that I want to draw a random person from to assign them the ticket. I'll save that. And now if I go down to this message where it was mentioning the whole channel, what we want to do is we want to replace that with a variable that's produced from this step that we created, this select a random member. So we'll insert that there and save that. And then we'll go ahead and publish those changes. And then we'll run that workflow one more time just to see how that changes it. So we'll request help. Say, still having problems with the ticketing system. We'll run that. And then we still get that message. Jump over to the Team IT channel. And we'll see that in this case, this is an interesting, it actually picked the workflow user. So there's a bot user that's the workflow, and I happened to pick that one. If we built it out a little bit more robust, we could ignore those types of users. Let me just run it again so we can see that it is picking a random person. We'll cross our fingers that it picks someone other than the workflow bot user. Ticketing system. Right, we'll jump over here. All right, and in this case, it happened to pick me, the user logged in, which is an unfortunate coincidence for a demo, but I think you get the idea. It's going to pick anybody that's in this list here, including the workflow user. All right, so that's kind of the gist of this. It's a pretty simple use case, but actually building it out is what we're going to jump into next and see, like, how would we do that within our own Slack app. All right, so if anybody wants to follow along, let me go ahead and treat this. If anybody wants to follow along, we've got a GitHub repo, and you're welcome to, so you can check this out if you want. There's 2 branches on there. There's Demo Frontiers Start and Demo Frontiers End. If you want to code along with me, you can check out the Start. If you want to just jump to the end where the code's all implemented, you can check out the End branch, or just follow along without coding along, whatever you prefer. And we'll share this with you so that you can go grab those after the presentation as well. So what I'll do, I'm going to switch to the Start branch. This would be a pretty boring demo if the code was all written already. And kind of an overview of the project. I've got a Node.js project. It's written in TypeScript, and I'll be using Bolt.js for the framework for my Slack application. Let me jump into the actual Slack app configuration. If you've built a Slack app, you've probably been in here before. And as far as adding a workflow step, it's just another feature that you can add to your Slack application. So I've got an app that's created here. If you want to add a step, you jump to workflow steps. And you'll have to turn on workflow steps, and then you can add up to 10 custom steps for your app that'll show up inside a workflow builder. So in this case, I'll just open the one I've already added, but you give it a name, and that's the name that it shows up inside a workflow builder. And then you give it a callback ID, which is a unique identifier to let you distinguish that step. Since you can have multiple steps, each of them just needs to have a unique callback ID. And we'll see where that comes into play when we start building it out. Once you add that, you'll also need to set up your interactivity shortcuts URLs along with your event subscriptions. I'll open up event subscriptions to show you how I have this set up. I use a service called ngrok, which just lets me set up a local tunnel to my local server on a publicly addressable URL. Not really sure why this is going so slow right now. But this is the URL that I have set up with Bolt. You have this /Slack events path that you can use for all of your event URLs. So I've got that enabled, got my URL there, and you automatically get this workflow step execute event set up for your bot once you add a workflow step. The last thing that you may need to do, other than also setting up interactivity and shortcuts, which is just plugging in that same URL, is depending on what your bot is going to do, you might have to add some additional scopes. You'll get this workflow steps execute scope added automatically because we have a workflow step, but I've also added the channels read scope because I'm going to be calling an API to read the membership of a channel. So depending what your step is going to do, you may need different scopes to be able to call those APIs. So that's the extent of my apps setup there. There's a README file in the repo that kind of gives you some information around the environment variables you might need to set up with your bot token and your signing secret. I actually don't think you need the verification token. We're not using that since we're using a signing secret. And as far as running it, I have ngrok running. These 2 windows here are not terribly important to see the contents of, but I have ngrok running here. And then over here, I have a TypeScript compilation mode running in like a watch mode. So my TypeScript compiler is running here. And then here is just my Bolt app that I'm running with a watch process that just watches the output of my TypeScript compilation. And then it'll restart as I make changes just to make development a little easier. So the details of that are inside of that GitHub repo. But let's jump in. So what we've got inside of our source folder, we set up this server, which just sets up our Bolt app. The Bolt app is defined right here. And this is about as simple as it gets for a Bolt app. It configures it using my token and signing secret, and then it gets started up in the server file. Doesn't do anything right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to start working on adding a step to it. So every step, I like to put it into its own folder. We'll call this random member step. And we'll create a file in there. And it's going to export a function that sets up our step. So we'll call it configure random member step. And it's going to take our Bolt app, which is that type, and then it won't return anything. And so if you've worked with Bolt, you might have done things like this where you have your Bolt app and you maybe set up like an action handler, with the different arguments you do for that, with the action ID and your callback. You might have set up like an event handler where you listen to certain events, or like a view submission. A workflow step is really, it encompasses all of those things. So to make it a little bit easier for us to build workflow steps into our Bolt apps, Bolt has a workflow step class that we can instantiate. So we create a new workflow step. And the first argument for that, actually I need to import that. So the first argument for this workflow step is our callback ID. And that's what we put into our app configuration screen, and we called it random member. And then the next argument is this config object, where you can provide 3 different sort of lifecycle hooks for your step. There's editing, and there is when you save a step, and then there's when you run or execute a step. So each of these, each of the values of these properties can be either an array or array of, or a single middleware function for Bolt. And middleware functions for Bolt are asynchronous functions that receive some properties that correspond to the action that's going on. And then you can call different APIs from within them. And in our case, we'll be doing some specific behavior inside of each of these. So I'm going to leave them as empty arrays right now. The last thing I have to do is on the Bolt app, I need to register my workflow step. So there's a step function that I can just pass that step to. The last thing I need to do is up here, back where I create my Bolt app, I just need to register, need to call that function that we just created. And we called it register. I call it configure. I think I called it configure. Configure. Nope. Config. Random member step. All right, and then we just need to give that our Bolt app. So it'll run, set up a step. It's really not going to do anything right now, so let's just start plugging in the pieces for what it needs to do. These being arrays, it's handy sometimes to have a series of functions that you can call for each of these. Sometimes you might want to separate some of the behavior for your handlers into different reusable functions, like loading some credentials for your third-party service, things like that. In our case, it's going to be fairly simple, so we won't bother with an array. We'll just have a single function. And that function takes, there's an ACK argument, which lets us acknowledge that we've received this action. We also get a workflow step object that represents the step being added or edited. And then we receive a configure callback function that we use to load up our configuration view. So in this case, what we'll do is we will acknowledge we received the action. We're just going to log out the step so we can see the details of it. And then we'll call configure. Now, if you've used any BlockKit views, you might be familiar with the API that's views.open. Configure is really a wrapper around that to open this specific workflow step view. It takes arguments. It can take any of the arguments that a view that you provide for a view for views.open. At a minimum, you have to provide the blocks that you want to render for that. So we'll just start with like a simple description of what our step's going to be using this section block. This should be step right there. Right. So we've created our step. We have a very simple edit handler for it. We haven't implemented save or execute yet, but let's jump into Workflow Builder and see like what this actually looks like now. So if I jump back over into Workflow Builder, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first remove this. Oops. Remove that. I'm going to change this to mention the channel again. Basically undo the stuff we did at the beginning here. And we'll add this step back that is now what our work in progress step. So we'll see it opens it up. We see the description that we added here. And if we jump over here to look at our console, we can see when that edit step comes in, we receive a couple pieces of information. We get the workflow ID, and this is a unique identifier to this specific workflow that the user's authoring. And then we also get a unique step ID. And that step ID is unique within this workflow ID. So that represents the specific step instance inside of the workflow. A user could add multiple instances of your steps inside the same workflow. Each of those would have their own step ID, but they could share the same workflow ID. And then we see there's an inputs object and an empty outputs array. We'll look into those a little bit more as we move on. But if I try to save this, it's not going to work right now because we haven't implemented our save. And we can see Bolt got that event, but it didn't know what to do with it because we haven't actually implemented it, and there was an error. So let's jump in and implement our save handler. We'll do the same thing here, where instead of an array, we'll just do a single function. It also receives an ACK argument. It gets a step. It's like an edit. And then it gets an update function that you can call to update your step. All right, so we'll acknowledge that we received it. We're going to log out the step we received. And then we'll just call update without any arguments. Jump back over. Try that again. So we'll add our step. See, we got our edit event that came in. We're going to save that. We got our save step that came in. And now that step exists in the workflow. And we can open it back up. We can see we got our edit again. Still no inputs or outputs. And we could save that again, and it would go through our save handler. One thing you receive in the save step handler is this workflow step edit ID. If you're using Bolt, you really don't have to think about that because it handles it for you automatically. If you're not using Bolt and this workflow step class that we're using here, you have to use this in an API call that is what configure wraps. And it's a lot like a trigger ID, and it kind of maps the step that's being edited in that session for the user. So our API docs include all of the different arguments that you have to send if you're calling the APIs directly to do this. But a lot of it's handled for us automatically with this workflow step class inside of Bolt. All right, so this is not terribly exciting right now. There's a really boring configuration screen here. And if we think about what we want this to do, and if we remember what it looked like when we first started this demo, we had a drop down here where we could pick a channel because we want to pick the channel that we're going to pick a random person from. So what we need to do is we need to update inside of our edit handler. This view that we open needs to include an input. So we'll add a channel select input right after our description block. And we have to give it a block ID along with an action ID, and that'll help us pull out some of those values when the step saves. So if we jump back over and we just open this up again, see now we've got this channel drop down. So I'm going to go ahead and pick something. I'm going to pick TMIT because that's the channel I want to pick a random user from. I hit save. And if I try to open that, you can see it didn't actually save that. And this is where inputs and outputs come into play. So what we want to do, let's jump into our save handler. So the way that workflow steps are abstracted, and one of the key principles of them is that we want them to operate a lot like this black box where there's this configuration authoring session that a user building a workflow can interact with your step and configure it a certain way. But when it's time to run the step, we want your step to be able to receive some inputs, and then it can do whatever it wants to do, take as long as it needs to take, and then produce some outputs. So there's this contract that your step can create at save time that defines what those inputs are and what those outputs will be. And that can all be dynamic. So in our case, one of the inputs we'll need in order to actually pick a random member from a channel is the channel ID that's been configured. So if you've handled any BlockKit modal view submissions before, this will be a lot like that, where we receive this view object, and then what we want to do is pluck off the channel ID that was in that dropdown. So we can get that. The view has this state.values property, and inside of there, from that point, you start referencing things by the block ID and then the action ID. So up here, we called this our channel block. And then it was channel action. And since this is a channel select, the property is going to be called selected channel. And we'll just default that to undefined if for some reason it's not set. All right, so then we've got that channel ID. So let's start adding some values to our update call here. This is where we can define what inputs our step is going to need when it runs. And inputs is an object where the keys can be whatever you want them to be. In this case, we'll just call it channel ID. And then the value of each of those keys has to be an object that at a minimum has a value property. And that's going to be the value for that particular keyed input. In our case, we just want it to also be the value of that channel ID that we pulled from our view. So we'll save that. Let's jump back into our step. And we can just use it in the state it's in. We'll pick TMIT channel. We'll hit save. And then if we open this back up, now if we look at our edit step, we have some values inside of our inputs. And this is basically the value that we saved as part of our channel ID input. We can see it's not actually selected over here, and we want it to be selected by default. So what we can do is up here in our edit step handler, we want to pluck off that channel ID input and use it as the initial value of that dropdown. So we can grab that from our step. It's going to have its inputs. It was channel ID is what we called it. And it's going to be value. And we'll just default it to undefined. So then we use that down here in our channel select element. The property we can set that's initial channel, and we'll set it to channel ID. Now if we close that and reopen it, we'll have our team IT channel there. Now, if you've been paying attention or if you've messed with Workflow Builder before, you probably noticed along with these static channels, sometimes you have the option of these like magical variable channels. And those are workflow variables. So the shortcut in our workflow, that's the thing that triggers it, produces this channel, this output, this variable, this channel where workflow started. So users could pick one of these dynamic values that's a dynamic channel, and they could save that. And everything flowed through our save handler fine. If we open this up to edit it, we'll see that the channel ID's value is a little different looking right now. It's this templatized data reference to that particular piece of workflow variable data. You can see we didn't have to do anything special to make it default to that here. And for the most part, for these dynamic values and variables inside of workflows, you as a developer don't have to do anything special to them. You may notice that they look a little different when you're actually saving them and assigning them to inputs, this compared to a static channel ID. But when the workflow actually runs, we'll get the realized value of that. So depending what channel this started in, that's the actual channel ID we would get when our step runs. I'm going to change this back to the Team IT channel because that's what I want it to be for this workflow. And that kind of wraps up our edit handler along with our save. Well, it almost wraps up our save. The last piece that we need our save to do, because remember, the goal of this step was to produce a random user that we could then use in our mention down here. But if we open this up and we look at our variables, we still don't have one that's available from that random member step. And that's because we haven't defined the actual outputs of this step yet when we save it. So we do that by when we call update, we can also provide outputs. And that's an array of objects where every object represents an output, and they have to have a name that's unique. And it can be anything. This can be anything that you want to key off of in your code. We'll call it random member. It has to have a type. It can be text, it can be channel, or it could be a user type. In this case, it's a user. And then you have to give it a label that's a human readable label that's presented to the user inside of Workflow Builder so they know how to use this variable. And we'll just call this random member. All right, so we've added that output. I'll close this send a message step. We'll open this again, and we're just going to resave it so it flows through that handler one more time. And now if we go into our send a message step and look at our variables, now we have this random member variable. So we'll take this, remove that, insert our random member there, and save it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and publish this because theoretically it's in the state we want it to be right now. All that's left for us to do is define our execute handler. So this is the portion of code that runs when someone actually starts a workflow. You receive an event, and then it's your steps or your app's responsibility to do whatever it needs to do to run that step. Taking the inputs you defined and then producing the outputs you said you would produce. So this is also an asynchronous function. It receives, if I can remember right, we get the step. And then I think it's called complete. We get a callback called complete for when our step is finished. So in this case, let's go ahead and just log our step. Execute and complete. Now we're not quite doing what we want to do here, but let's just talk through a little bit. What we want to be able to do is we want to get our channel ID that we're going to look up a random member from. We're going to make an API call to conversations.members. That's the endpoint that we want to hit to get all the members of the channel. And then we want to pick a random member. And then for our complete, we want to output that random member as one of our outputs. All right, so to get our channel ID, already done this in our edit handler, so it's going to be the same thing where we say step.inputs.channel ID value. Default that to undefined. Now, if we don't have a channel here, if we don't have a channel ID, we really can't do much. And there's really no point in proceeding. So what we could do, just return. The downside of just returning is, from the workflow perspective, it's going to look like our step got started and it's just hung there on that step. And in reality, like, this step will never be able to complete because we don't have a channel ID. For some reason, we're missing it. So what we can do in that case, there's another function that's available that's passed in, that's fail. We can actually fail the step, and this indicates to the end user that, hey, there's something wrong with this step. You know, we had bad configuration, or maybe a service is down, we weren't able to complete a call. You provide an error object that has a message property, and this is an opportunity to provide a message to the author of the workflow that they'll be presented inside of their workflow's activity log. We can say no channel was provided. You know, it's good to use these as an opportunity to explain to the user how they might be able to fix their step. So you might say something like, please reconfigure the step. You know, if they go back, open it, and set a channel, that should fix it. All right, so at this point, we know we've got a channel ID. Our Bolt app has this client on it that we can use to make API calls. So we want to call conversations members. Now this takes a token, and then it takes a channel. And the channel is going to be our channel ID that we plucked out here of our steps inputs. And the token, we want to use our bot token. Now, since we're using Bolt, it provides this context object that it automatically looks that up for you. So we'll use the context bot token. This is going to give us, I have to wait on that since it's synchronous call. And this members should be an array of strings. Right. The next thing we'll want to do is we want to pick a random member from there using the power of math. And I can never remember this syntax, so I always have to copy it. We will grab a random entry out of that members array. Oh, you know what? I need to cast this into string array. Oh, actually, you know what? I missed a step here. This is going to give us an API result object. And then from that, we'll create an array of string members using the result.members property, and then default it to an empty array. All right, and then we'll use that and grab a random channel member. So the last step that we have to do is provide that random channel member as an output when we complete our step. So when you call complete, you can provide your outputs, and you do that just by providing an object that includes all the keys that you used when we defined our outputs at the save. So in this case, the name is what we want to key off of. We call it random member. So, and then the value will just be our random channel member. And that should be it. All right, so let's just try and run it. What are the odds that it actually works, right? Okay, so I think we've got our workflow all set up to use that in our message down here. So what we're going to do is we'll jump into our help channel and we'll run that shortcut again. So the website is down. All right, so we get that message there. If we jump over here to our Team IT channel, hey, it worked. It picked Hina and let them know about Johan, which is actually me, logged in, and it gave the request. We'll just run it one more time to make sure that it is indeed random like we think it is, or at least as random as JavaScript's math.random is. And we jump over here and it picked a different person. Cool. So that's it for building this step that picks a random member. There's a lot of ways you could, the team might find that they do this for a while and they're realizing, like this random assignment is not working really well. And, Kimberly's getting like twice as many for some reason. So they might go in and adjust the code and try to figure out how to make it use some sort of rotation, or like see when the last person was assigned something. And that really gets to like the last point that I guess I want to share about our motivation for adding the ability for apps to provide steps is that the abstraction or the way that these steps are contained in these reusable pieces of functionality where they receive inputs and produce outputs makes them very composable. What we found is users build workflows in lots of different ways that we didn't expect. What they might be able to do, they might decide, we want to keep track of every time we assign one of these tickets to somebody. And they could do that in a really low friction way by going in. There's a Google Sheets step that we added that you can install into your teams if you use Google Sheets. And they could use the add a row to Google Sheet and just write records for that particular ticketing system. Like they could say who was assigned it, who opened the request, when did it happen, and the details of it. And then just keep sort of a low friction audit log of it. So there's a lot of ways that people can start to combine these steps. And as more and more steps become available, users will be able to use them in a lot of different ways that, I don't know, is often surprising, and you may not have intended when you first built it. But by adhering to this concept of a step receives inputs, does whatever it needs to, and produces outputs, they can become very flexible for end users. Anyways, hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully, maybe it sparked some ideas about different steps you could create at your companies, whether they're internal ones or on the apps that you work on. We've got a lot of resources. We've got this GitHub repo that if you wanted to take another look at this demo, we're going to be adding some more steps there over time as examples. We've got API docs on our site about this new feature. And in our directory, we also have, in the Slack app directory, there's a list of apps that have steps that you could look at to get an idea of what are the different kinds of steps that apps are providing, maybe for your own use or also for inspiration about what you might want to consider building for your apps. All right, well, I'm going to stop the share and turn the time over to answer if there's any questions we can answer or go through. Happy to do that.
I do have a quick follow-up question, which is, you mentioned that there are others who are already using these steps. So any ones that stand out for you just for inspiration's sake? Like are any of them your favorites?
Yeah, the ones that there's the Google Sheets one. I actually built those ones, so I'm biased in that sense that we built it because we had a lot of people request the ability to do that. A lot of our users use Google Docs and Google Sheets, so you can get a lot of utility out of those. There's like an add row, lookup row, update row, and delete row step. But one of probably the most flexible step is one that Zapier produced, where they've integrated it with like something around 120 of their services. So you can add a Zapier step and then configure that to perform different Zap operations on a bunch of the different services. So that can be like a really flexible way, if you're a Zapier user, to start connecting workflows to different services that Zapier connects with. I haven't seen yours yet, but I'd like to check it out.
Absolutely, and I'd love your feedback. But on Zapier, is sort of the vision that the step function would sort of free you up from using Zapier, or is the vision that you'll work hand in hand with Zapier? So like long term, couple years down the line, because Zapier at the end of the day is a paid product, so it does add to the costs. So would it be better for people to use it natively, or is this like in conjunction with Zapier?
It's definitely in conjunction with Zapier. One of the, Zapier integrates with, I don't know how many thousand services that they have connected.
Right.
They do an extremely good job of making it so you can connect different systems, like systems to system workflows and pipelines. And there's a huge feature set there. There is, it is a product in its own that has a cost. So what we see is, inside of Workflow Builder and Slack, we can surface and connect those like human events and human interactions that happen inside of workflows, like a user submitting a form, a member joining a channel, somebody reacting with an emoji to a message, that can kind of kickstart some process. And if you need something very complex that Zapier provides, like you have the ability to call out and do that. But it'll be interesting to see as more apps provide more steps, the different levels of granularity of functionality that you can compose inside of workflows.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. So everybody feel free to unmute yourself and ask any question that you might have. I know we are a little over time already, but if you have any questions, I would love to.
Looks like Nina wrote one. Are you planning on adding more flexibility to Workflow Builder rather than focusing on Slack builders, or rather on how to add more adoption for power users, more templates? Yeah, so there's a very exciting roadmap for Workflow Builder, and I think that's what the question is. So correct me if I'm wrong, Nina, but some of the things that we are working on for Workflow Builder is like a more robust template library, a way to be able to build and share templates within your organization, and for apps to provide templates that go along with their workflow templates that go along with their apps, and a focus on making Workflow Builder even more powerful and robust for non-technical Slack users is a huge area of focus for us. So this steps from apps is kind of one of the it's a first step at trying to figure out how can we make this surface area for developers to build some functionality, but have it be flexible and composable and like usable by Slack users, without needing without the developer having to build it for a very specific purpose. So we want to find more ways to do that, to make it so developers can build these pieces of functionality, these units of functionality. And in this case, a workflow step is the unit we've done. But then end users can use that in any way that they could connect it with other steps. Is that okay? If I missed something, let me know, Nina.
Excellent.
I have
Anybody
a question,
else?
Brad.
Any other questions?
So the most of the logic that you were working with, it was in Node.js and TypeScript, right? And like I have lost touch with Node.js and TypeScript. I mostly work on Python. So how easy it is for me to port over this into Python? Is it going to be a big lift, or is there any GitHub repo that I can start with?
Yeah, so I could be wrong, but I don't. So we have a bolt for Python that you may or may not have seen or used. Like that will get you pretty far. That workflow step class that I was using is an abstraction that the goal is to the developer relations team is working on adding that kind of abstraction to each of the different Bolt frameworks. I don't think it's there for the Bolt for Python yet, though. But that repo would be the best place. The Bolt for Python repo would be the best place to go to see like the status of that. The team is really transparent on all the features that they work on these frameworks, and always open to feedback if you're a Python user and you want to use that framework and you have feedback on it. But that being said, all of the underlying functionality inside of the Bolt frameworks support what you need to build this kind of step. What you end up doing, instead of creating this workflow class instance that you register with Bolt, you set up the different handlers that you need at a more fine-grained level, like your apps. You'd set up an action handler that would map to the edit flow. You'd set up a view submission handler that maps to the save flow, and you'd set up an event handler for the workflow step execute event. So you end up with a little more boilerplate code for each of those, but it's in essence the same levels of abstraction.
Gotcha. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah.
I think we are a couple minutes over. Just one last thing that I wanted to get in was we were contemplating whether we need to do another session before the end of the year. So hopefully, like before Thanksgiving, in fact. So any thoughts, anybody, on doing another session? We have other speakers lined up, so we could do it either before Thanksgiving or early next year. Any thoughts? I think everybody's muted. Feel free to type in your answer, or we could discuss it on the New York community channel Slack itself. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. Thank you, Brad, for the awesome talk. And demos in the real world, they have a tendency to mess up. This one went awesome. Yep. And so thank you so much. And we'll be posting the recording soon. Okay.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Have a good one.
Bye.